Hey guys, welcome back to Moonlight&Sleepless. Tonight we're drifting gently into the land of pharaohs, pyramids, and a river that doesn't just flow, it remembers. You see, most civilizations feared floods. Ancient Egypt, they prayed for them. Because when the Nile didn't rise, nothing else did. No crops, no celebrations, no survival. Tonight, we're not just walking beside the Nile, we're sinking into the mystery of how ancient Egyptians somehow, without satellites or smartphones, knew when the river would rise. It wasn't guesswork. It was a cosmic whisper. And we're about to listen in. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins, as it always does, with water. But not just any water, this is the Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, winding through desert like a silk ribbon dropped by the gods. To the untrained eye, it's just a river. To the ancient Egyptians, it was Hapi, the divine bringer of bounty. The river didn't just quench thirst or grow crops, it defined time itself. Their year didn't start in January. It started when the waters rose. Imagine standing barefoot on the riverbank in June, around 5,000 years ago. The air is thick with heat. Dragonflies dart in lazy spirals, and your village elder stares upriver in absolute silence. He's not watching the water. He's watching the sky. Because the river listens to the stars. Or maybe the stars listen to the river. Either way, the flood is coming or notent. Everything depends on that. Here's the catch. The Nile flood wasn't exactly predictable. It didn't arrive on the same day every year. Sometimes it came early, sweeping across the fields like a blessing with bad manners. Sometimes it delayed, and people looked skyward with dry lips and prayers trembling in their throats. But despite all that uncertainty, ancient Egyptians managed to create a rhythm, a trust, even a schedule around it. How? Let's pause there. Because this wasn't the kind of prediction that involved long charts and weather graphs. This was older than that. This was intuitive science woven into mythology, religion, and ritual. The river was a living being, and like all living things, it had moods, patterns, secrets. The people who depended on it didn't just observe it, they knew it. The way you know the exact moment a storm will start just by how the air shifts on your skin. And so every year, when the heat pressed down and the cicadas grew too loud, everyone waited. The farmers, the priests, the potters, even the children. Everyone looked to the horizon. They waited not just for water, but for confirmation that the world still made sense. Because if the Nile failed to rise, it wasn't just a bad season. It was a sign that the gods were silent, that balance had broken. But here's where things get mystical. Long before the floodwaters reached Memphis or Thebes, long before they kissed the temple steps in Karnak or spread across the fields of Giza, people at the very edges of Egypt already knew it was coming. How? That's where the magic lives. In the stars, in the stones, and in something else. Something almost musical. A rhythm only the oldest hearts could hear. Because this wasn't just about observing nature. It was about interpreting its language. Every breeze, every change in bird migration, every strange-colored sunrise held a potential clue. The river wasn't silent, it sang. And for those willing to sit, to listen, to wait without needing to control it, told its story, slowly, softly, like a bedtime secret. So tonight, as your breath slows and your eyes get heavy, picture yourself standing in the shadow of a palm tree, sand warm beneath your feet, watching the river curve like a smile through the land. You don't know if the flood will come, but you feel it, in the pulse of the wind, in the hush before dawn, in the way even the animals have paused, as if holding their breath. The Nile isn't just water, it's time. And in Egypt, time always comes with a current. The thing about waiting for a flood is it's never quiet. Not really. The land may look still, but beneath the surface, everything is bracing. Villages along the Nile enter a kind of soft tension each year, between late spring and midsummer. It's not panic, it's not fear, it's awareness. You can feel it in the way the women tie their headscarves tighter, in the way children are told not to wander too far near the riverbanks, in the way the elders tilt their heads slightly more often, not to look but to listen. Because when you live by the Nile, you don't just work with the water, you wait for it. The ancient Egyptians didn't build their calendar around months. They built it around moods. And the most important mood of all was that deep, unpredictable moment between dry and flood. That space in time when everyone looked to the south and wondered, will it come this year? No 2 years were ever exactly alike. The Nile rose between June and September. Yes, but that window was slippery. Some years, the waters came early, bold and fast, like a god returning from exile. Other years they delayed, creeping in with a kind of guilty hesitation. And every day they didn't come was a weight, a pressure. Not knowing wasn't just inconvenient, it was existential. Think about it. This river wasn't just water, it was law. When it flooded well, the black silt it left behind turned desert into Eden. Wheat grew high, papyrus unfurled, cattle fattened, temples sparkled with offerings. But when the flood underperformed, too low, too slow, or worse, too late, meant famine. It meant tightening rations, cutting seed, praying longer. And yes, it meant taxes. The pharaoh's granaries didn't fill themselves. So you can see why waiting wasn't passive. It was loaded. Entire communities depended on knowing when. And yet, without clocks, without barometers, or fancy meteorological maps, how could they possibly guess? The answer lies in their deep relationship with rhythm. The ancient Egyptians weren't passive observers of nature. They were readers of it. The Nile had tells, the way it smelled, the color of its shallows, the number of fish caught upstream, even the density of clouds hanging low over Nubia. Everything was a sign, everything whispered. And those whispers, they weren't just heard by farmers or fishermen. They were recorded, tracked, and interpreted, sometimes centuries over centuries by the priests. The temple priests weren't just spiritual leaders. They were climate historians, calendar engineers, and natural psychologists. Some had dedicated their entire lives to studying the seasons. They maintained record stone carved, papyrus rolled off past floods, early risings, false alarms. They knew how to spot when the Nile's mood changed. And they were the ones people looked to when the sky stayed too clear, or when the upstream rains didn't arrive on time. But here's the truly poetic part. Even with all their tracking and prayers, they still couldn't predict with certainty. The Nile didn't belong to anyone. It moved on its own terms. That unpredictability wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system. The Egyptians believed that order and chaos were always dancing, and the river was the stage. Still, they tried. Every morning, priests would perform river rites, offering incense and reciting chants meant to wake the waters. In some temples, young initiates would pour measured jugs of water as part of a symbolic reenactment of the flood's arrival, not to control the river, but to honor the waiting. Because that's the thing, ancient Egyptians weren't obsessed with control. They were devoted to harmony. The idea wasn't to force the Nile to flood. It was to tune in to when it would, to align yourself with nature so completely that you began to anticipate its rhythm like a favorite song. You may not know the exact moment the chorus hits, but you feel it coming. And tonight, maybe you feel it too. That strange pause in the air, that quiet tension between not yet and almost. The same space the ancients stood in, hearts half full, eyes turned south, ears open to the smallest shift in the wind, because the water's coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it's already on its way. And until then, we wait, just like they did. Not in fear, in faith. When the Nile held its breath, the priests looked up, not at clouds, not at birds, but at stars. Because in ancient Egypt, the real flood predictor didn't come from the ground. It came from the sky, specifically from one star, a tiny bright blue spark just before sunrise, the one they called Sopdet, and we call Sirius, the dog star. And every year, without fail, its appearance on the horizon marked the turning point between dry land and rising tide. It wasn't superstition, it was precision. Imagine the scene. It's just before dawn, sometime in early July. The horizon is still cloaked in dark purple, the air cool for once, the silence deep and sacred. A temple scribe, wrapped in linen, eyes narrowed, stands on the eastern platform of a high temple roof. He's not blinking, he's waiting. Then just above the desert's edge, a single star winks into view. Faint, pale, but unmistakable. Sirius has returned, and that means the flood is coming. This moment was so important. It was baked into their calendar, literally. The appearance of Sirius in the dawn sky marked the start of the Egyptian New Year. Not a party, not fireworks, just a soft shimmer in the sky, a sign that the world was beginning again. You see, to them, the rising of Sirius wasn't just astronomy. It was a reunion. The goddess Sobdet, returning from her time in the Duathe underworld. Her reappearance meant the gods were in motion, the balance was restored, and the river would soon rise. But here's what makes it truly magical. The heliacal rising of Sirius, when it becomes visible just before sunrise, after a period of invisibility, coincided almost perfectly with the Nile flood, year after year. That kind of cosmic synchronicity, it's no wonder they believed it divine. And it's no wonder they watched the stars more carefully than the river itself. Over time, temple astronomer priests became masters of the night sky. They tracked constellations, noted alignments, memorized the subtle shifts in timing. In places like Karnak, Heliopolis, and Dendera, temples were aligned with such precision that sunlight would fall on specific altar points only during key star risings. These buildings weren't just holy sites. They were observatory as giant stone clocks carved from belief and calculation. And yes, they recorded it. On walls, on pillars, on fragile strips of papyrus. These weren't just myths. They were data sets. One inscription in Edfu mentions, "The return of Sopdet with the flood at her heels." Another in Esna speaks of, "The goddess who announces water by light." You start to realize they weren't watching the sky. Instead of the river, they were watching the sky for the river. It's humbling, isn't it? That without telescopes, without supercomputers, without even glass lenses, they knew more about the seasonal rhythm of their land than many modern people know about their own backyard. Because they paid attention. Deep, reverent, generational attention. But there's something else beneath all this stargazinga quiet kind of hope. When the river didn't rise on time, or rose too high, or didn't rise at all, the people could still look up. And there it was, Sirius, constant, reliable. A reminder that balance could return, even when the earth felt unsteady. They saw the universe not as something distant and cold, but as something connected. The same divine order that shaped the stars also shaped the Nile, and that meant everything had meaning. Nothing was random. If the flood was late, it wasn't failure. It was message. The gods were always speaking. You just had to know where to look. And so now, close your eyes. Picture the early morning haze, the sand just beginning to glow. A young acolyte blinks against sleep and watches the sky, heart pounding as that single bright star emerges. It's so small, so brief, but it carries the promise of life, of water, of beginning again. That moment doesn't just belong to history. It belongs to you too. Because maybe tonight, as you lay here between dreams, a part of you is looking up too, quietly, hopefully, waiting for your own small light to rise. You wouldn't expect a single point of light to change the course of an empire, but Sirius did. The Egyptians didn't just admire it, they trusted it. And in the moments before sunrise, when most of the world still slept, it was this little blue-white star that whispered to priests, farmers, and kings alike, "It's time." But what made Sirius more than just a pretty celestial sparkle was how predictable it was. In a world where weather lied, crops failed, and rivers sometimes sulked, Sirius always showed up on cue. That consistency turned it into a cosmic metronome, syncing heaven and earth with an elegance that felt divine. They didn't call it Sirius, of course. To them, she was Sopdet, goddess of renewal, a celestial woman crowned with a 5-pointed star. She wasn't just a marker in the sky. She was a presence, an event. Her annual appearance, after 70 days of invisibility, coincided almost perfectly with the Aket season, the inundation. And unlike our digital calendars, this wasn't marked by numbers, it was marked by anticipation. You felt it coming. The air changed. The birds flew differently. The Nile, still low, seemed to hold its breath. And then, one morning there she was. But there's a detail that gets missed in the simplified versions. Sopdet didn't rise randomly. She rose at a very specific moment. Just before dawn, when the sky was still dark but beginning to shift, and the sun hadn't yet blurred her out. This narrow window, sometimes only a few minutes long, was everything. Catch it, and you knew the year was about to turn. Miss it, and you'd have to wait another cycle. So the temples trained specialists, not just priests, but sky watchers, trained from childhood to read light, shadow, and the arc of the stars with more precision than a sundial could ever dream of. In cities like Thebes and Elephantine, temple rooftops were fitted with stair-step platforms, aligned not just with the cardinal points, but with the star's path. Imagine climbing those steps in the dark, barefoot on cold stone, surrounded by incense smoke and the soft murmur of pre-dawn prayers. Your breath fogs. You squint, you wait. And then just for a heartbeat, Sopdet returns. And with her, the promise that the Nile is rising too. But Sopdet wasn't alone. She was the celestial counterpart of Isis, and her heliacal rising was part of a much larger myth, the return of Osiris, the rebirth of life. The morning turned to joy. It wasn't just astronomy. It was storytelling written in stars, a cosmic drama playing out every year, reassuring Egyptians that even death real or seasonal was temporary, that water would return, that crops would grow, that order would follow chaos, as surely as the sun follows night. And yes, pharaohs paid attention. Court astrologers and temple astronomers were part of royal infrastructure. Their observations weren't optional. They were state-level data. A misreading could mean mistimed planting, famine, civil unrest. So these sky readings weren't taken lightly. Records were kept in secret books, passed down like sacred recipes. One wrong angle, one cloudy morning, and you might doom a province to hunger. Which brings us to something quietly astonishing. The Egyptian calendar, rooted in the rising of Sirius, was so accurate it came within minutes of the actual solar year, long before leap years, long before Gregorian corrections. They didn't even need to know the Earth orbited the sun. They just watched. They just listened. And the stars told them everything. So the next time you step outside in the early hours and see that solitary star burning above the horizon, know that you're looking at something ancient, a signal once interpreted by barefoot priests on stone steps, scribes with ink-stained fingers, farmers readying their fields. A star that told them when to hope. And now here you are, under your own ceiling of stars, listening to the same rhythms centuries later. You don't need to predict a flood, but maybe you too are waiting for a signal, a moment, a return of something you thought was lost. And just like Sopdet, it may arrive silently, gently, before the world wakes. You just have to know where to look. Imagine walking into a temple not to pray, but to check the calendar. No paper, no ink, no ticking hands on a wall, just sunlight, stone, and silence. That was the ancient Egyptian method of timekeeping, and honestly, it might have been more accurate than your phone. Deep within the walls of places like Karnak, Dendera, and Edfu, something remarkable happened every year. The light told them when the river would rise. These weren't just temples. They were observatories. You stepped through a long stone corridor, the air cool even in the sweltering heat, and at the end of the hallway, just once a year, a single shaft of sunlight slips through a narrow slit and lands perfectly on a carved glyph. That glyph? Usually something symbolic. A rising lotus, a flood marker, a star-shaped crown. And when the light hit that mark, the priests knew. It's time. Sopdet has returned. The river is coming. The year begins. This wasn't metaphor, it was designed. These temples were engineered with such celestial precision that their inner sanctuaries became calendars carved in shadow. Alignments were intentional. Angles measured with string, stone, and starlight. They knew where the sun would rise on the day Sirius appeared, and they built accordingly. Even the thickest columns bowed to the stars. But it wasn't just about light. These temples also housed perpetual calendars, not written on scrolls, but chiseled into walls. Lists of star risings, seasonal gods, flood cycles, entire agricultural guides immortalized in granite. Think of it as Egypt's version of Google Calendar, except you had to walk 100 meters and interpret hieroglyphs while being stared at by falcon-headed gods. And it worked. Year after year, generation after generation, the calendar held, the rituals aligned. The river respondedor seemed to... That was part of the genius. The combination of natural precision and spiritual storytelling, because the people didn't separate time from belief. To track Sopdet wasn't just science, it was worship. In fact, some temples had rooms called star chambers, accessible only to the highest priests. These were dark, silent, sacred places where observations were recorded, often in total secrecy. Star charts, horizon markers, even ceiling murals painted with night sky maps. These weren't for tourists. They were working documents. Celestial ledgers. The night sky was their data feed, and they read it better than any astronomer with a telescope today. And the effect wasn't just local. When a major temple confirmed Sirius had risen, messengers would be dispatched to other districts. The flood is near, they'd say. Farmers would begin preparations. Markets adjusted prices. Scribes recalibrated tax tables. The entire kingdom moved in rhythm with the stars. The heavens dictated the economy. Even the pharaoh's rituals followed this calendar. In festivals like Wepet Renpet, the opening of the year, processions would begin at dawn to honor Sopdet's return. Musicians played. Priests poured sacred water to symbolize the oncoming flood. Everyone knew the signal had Komano from the palace, but from the sky. But as reliable as this was, it still required vigilance. Cloudy mornings could obscure the star. Sandstorms could mislead. One missed signal, one poorly timed festival, and things could fall out of harmony. That's why the temple records didn't just rely on one source. They cross-checked star charts, flood level patterns, seasonal animal behavior. It was a full-spectrum predictive model. And at the center of it all, light. Because light told the truth, quietly. It couldn't be bribed or exaggerated. It fell or it didn't. It struck the mark or missed. It was the God's way of speaking clearly, without metaphor. And when that one perfect beam lit up the right symbol deep in the temple's core, it wasn't just information, it was confirmation. The gods were still paying attention. The world still made sense. And now, as you lie in the soft dark of your own quiet room, maybe a little light slips through your curtain. Not sacred, maybe, but still meaningful. A reminder that time flows around you, not just in hours and minutes, but in cycles, returns, soft arrivals. The kind of time the Egyptians trusted, the kind that doesn't rush, it waits. Then speaks in light. Now let's head down, past the temples and stargazers, into something more grounded literally. Because while priests looked to the stars for cosmic clues, The Egyptians also built something far more practical right next to the Nile's banks: Nilometers. The name sounds modern, but the design? Ancient genius. Picture a quiet stairwell descending into the river, or a circular stone shaft with carved markings running up its side. No gadgets, no gears, just rising water and engraved lines. And yet, these silent measuring tools could tell an entire nation how good or bad the year was going to be. Nilometers came in a few forms. The simplest was a column sunk into a pit connected to the river. As the Nile swelled, the water level rose against the markings. Think of it like a divine thermometer, but instead of checking for fever, you were checking for famine. If the water didn't reach a certain height, disaster. If it rose too high, equally disastrous. Floods that were too generous could wash away crops, destroy homes, and erode the delicate balance of silt and soil. The sweet spot? Right in the middle. Moderation wasn't just a virtue, it was a survival strategy. The marks weren't arbitrary. They were based on centuries of observation. Generations of scribes, priests, and farmers had recorded the outcomes of each flood height. 17 cubits? Perfect. 14? Too dry. 22? Brace yourself. Over time, these records created a hydrological memory system, chiseled into stone and passed down as a sacred equation. Water level equals destiny. Some Nilometers were modest and tucked away. Others, like the one on Elephantine Island near Aswan, were grand and ceremonial, complete with staircases and inscriptions honoring Hapi, the Nile god. There, the river was greeted with offerings and songs as it rose. Imagine descending those cool, shadowed steps, the scent of wet limestone rising with the water, each mark on the wall a whisper from history. This much means life, this much means loss. And this wasn't just a priestly affair. The flood level determined taxation. Yes, your grain, your goats, your debt to the state was tied directly to the river's mood. The Nile was, in essence, the kingdom's accountant. The higher it rose, within reason, the better the harvest, and the more Pharaoh's scribes expected from you. A good flood meant full granaries and a full treasury. A poor flood meant austerity, short rations, and whispered fears in the marketplace. But here's what's wild. The people trusted this system. They didn't see it as bureaucratic cruelty. They saw it as balance. If the flood was fair, the taxes were too. The state and the river worked together, and the Nilometer stood in between thema translator of divine intent. When the water kissed the right cubit mark, it wasn't just a number. It was a promise. The gods are with us this year. Of course, nothing is perfect. Some years, the Nilometer readings were ambiguous. The waters stalled, rose unevenly. One side of the river flooded, the other did not. And when readings became unclear, panic trickled in. There are records of temples performing emergency rites, of extra prayers offered at the feet of Hapi statues, of festivals adjusted last minute. The river, once calm and dependable, would grow mysterious again. And when that happened, all eyes turned back to the priests, not for explanation, but for reassurance. Still, these tools lasted. Some Nilometers were in use for millennia. They survived floods, dynastic collapse, even the slow creep of time itself. One was still being referenced during the Islamic period, long after Egypt's pharaohs had turned to dust. That's how good the system was. When something works for 2,000 years, it earns its place. So tonight, picture one of those quiet staircases, half submerged, with moonlight glinting on the rippling water just below a carved mark. There's no sound but the splash of a frog, the soft creak of reeds, and somewhere nearby, a scribe leans forward with a little wax tablet etching down the level. He's not just measuring the river, he's measuring the future. And just like that, you realize maybe we've never stopped doing that. Reading signals in the rising and falling around us, watching the levels of emotion, of time, of silence, waiting for the moment when everything hits just the right mark, and we can say, yes, this year we live. Every year, just before the Nile began to rise, something curious happened across villages dotting its edge. The air got heavier, the soil cracked a little deeper, and the mud brick workers, the humble brick makers, suddenly became very busy. It wasn't random. It wasn't seasonal coincidence. It was anticipation. You see, while priests watched the stars and scribes check nilometers, these workers listened to the earth with their hands. They didn't need scrolls. They had mud. And mud, in ancient Egypt, was a kind of early warning system. Here's how it worked. Mud brick was the backbone of everyday construction. Temples and palaces might be stone, but homes, walls, granaries, those were built from bricks dried under the sun. And the recipe? Simple. Nile silt, chopped straw, a little water, a lot of labor. But when the flood was near, the texture of the earth changed, slightly, subtly, and only those who handled it daily could feel it. Elder brickmakers could tell when the river was about to swell by how the clay behaved too dry, too gritty, too heavy, the way it stuck to fingers, the way it cracked as it dried. These weren't scientific measurements, but instinctual ones, generational muscle memory. Their calloused palms knew things the stars didn't. If the silt became sticky too early, they knew the water was rising upstream. If it remained powdery too long, they worried. It meant delay, drought. And this wasn't just personal knowledge, it was communal. Brick production often ramped up in the weeks before the flood, not after. Why? Because once the Nile arrived, fields became temporary lakes. Clay pits flooded. Drying grounds vanished. If you didn't have enough bricks stacked and sun-hardened before the flood, your building season was over. So when the brickyards got noisy, when smoke from the kilns hung thicker in the morning air, it wasn't just about construction, it was about timing. The flood was coming. Some families passed down flood prediction through their brick-making logs. Yes, logs' rudimentary tallies of how many bricks could be made in a certain stretch of days. When numbers dipped sharply, they didn't just blame lazy laborers. They blamed moisture, the coming of happy, the subtle rise in groundwater long before the surface changed. And this strange, low-tech forecasting system played a quiet role in Egypt's larger survival rhythm. If the workers shifted production early, the priest took notice. If the kilns stayed cold too long, something was off. In one rare fragment of temple notes, a scribe writes, "The bricks have not sung this month," meaning the kilns were silent, and that silence spoke volumes. But there's more. Some temples believed that brick itself held symbolic power over the flood. Clay was the body of the Nile. To mold it was to communicate with the river. That's why Some religious ceremonies included the ritual smashing of unfired bricks releasing a message back to the water, asking it to rise kindly. In some stories, even Osiris was buried in a brick structure. Mud was not mundane, it was memory. And of course, the bricks told stories of their own. Marks were pressed into them before drying names, symbols, sometimes even prayers. One brick found near Thebes reads, "Let the waters come, as they did in the time of my father." Simple, hopeful, a soft kind of magic baked into the walls. So the next time you think of ancient Egyptian construction, don't picture only grand monuments. Picture barefoot workers kneeling in the dust, pressing straw into silt, talking quietly as they shaped the season in their hands. They might not have looked like priests, but in their own way, they were interpreters of the Nile's mood, builders of homes, yes, but also accidental prophets. And tonight as you rest, think of that texture. Earth warmed by sun, fingers dipping into cool clay, a rhythm of patting, stacking, drying, the hush before the water returns, the quiet hum of people who didn't need to see the river rise to know it was coming. They felt it in the weight of the dirt, in the tempo of the wind, in the softness of the silence. If the Nile was generous, people ate. If it wasn't, they paid anyway. Because in ancient Egypt, taxes weren't just coins or grain or labor. They were tethered to the river's behavior. And nothing made that connection clearer than the moment the flood arrived and the scribes rolled out their tablets. Welcome to the yearly ritual that made the Nile not only a source of life, but also the strictest accountant in the kingdom. You see, the Egyptians had a surprisingly advanced taxation system. It wasn't just guesswork or give what you can. It was detailed, regionally scaled, and crucially based on expected harvests. And what determined the expected harvest? The flood. The higher and more balanced the inundation, the more silt, the more planting, the more food. So when the waters came, the economy took a deep breath. And when they didn't, people did too. Here's how it worked. Soon after the floodwaters began to recede, scribes called Seshemu traveled from village to village, carrying portable writing kits, measuring ropes, and an expression somewhere between bored and powerful. They weren't just bureaucrats. They were living calculators, tasked with measuring how much land had been fertilized, how well the seeds would take, and how much grain each farmer was likely to produce. Based on those numbers, they'd assign a tax rate. Not next year. Now. Imagine the scene. Your family's field has just re-emerged from weeks underwater. The mud is thick, the frogs are loud, and suddenly a group of clean-shaven men in white linen arrives, unrolling cords across your land and making quiet notes in ink. One looks at you, doesn't smile, dips his reed pen. 15 bushels. You nod because what else can you do? But this wasn't arbitrary. The scribes weren't evil. They were trained to observe pattern show. Certain elevations held water, how certain slopes dried faster, how the soil looked underfoot. Some of them came from farming families themselves. They knew that 1 cubit too little water meant your barley would wither, and 1 cubit too much meant it never got planted at all. Their job was to find the line between fair and ruin. Sometimes they got it right. Sometimes, not so much. To help them, the readings from the Nilometers played a key role. These public measurements, often posted in temple courtyards or announced by town criers, were like annual financial forecasts. A flood level of 17 cubits? Scribes expected a great harvest. Taxes went up. A disappointing 12? Lower expectations, lower taxes, but also more pressure on state grain reserves. Everyone was watching, not just farmers, merchants, priests. Even the royal court adjusted plans based on those first measurements. And then there was grain banking. Yes, they had that too. Pharaoh's granaries weren't just storage. They were part of the fiscal system. If you couldn't pay your tax in goods, you paid in labor, or promises, or pledges of next season's harvest. Some unlucky families gave up land. Others gave up time weeks of labor in temple fields or public works projects. The Nile might bless you with food, but it always collected its cut. But perhaps the most fascinating part? People didn't seem to resent the system. The Nile was seen as just, and because tax was tied to its behavior, the whole process felt natural. If the river was generous, so were you. If the river withheld, so did the crown. It was reciprocity, not robbery. And it made the whole society feel as if it moved with the river, not against it. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some farmers kept secret plots hidden behind reeds, growing illicit onions and praying the scribes didn't notice. Some bribed officials, some misreported seed counts, but overall the system held for centuries, through dynasties and droughts and even invaders. Why? Because it was based on the most ancient truth of all: follow the river. So tonight, as you lie still and the world quiets, imagine that slow rise of muddy water across the fields, the soft squelch of sandals, the rustle of papyrus scrolls, and the careful scratching of ink onto parchment. Somewhere, a scribe is making a mark, not just about grain, but about balance, about trust in a system as old as the stars, as steady as the flood, as human as the tilt of a head waiting for water. When the Nile behaved, Egypt flourished. But when it didn't, when the flood came too high, or not at all, people didn't just blame the weather. They looked to the gods. Because in the mind of the ancient Egyptian, nature wasn't mechanical, it was relational. The flood wasn't a force, it was a gift, or a warning. And behind that gifter threat stood divine personalities, each with their own moods, agendas, and cryptic silences. At the center of it all was Hapi, the Nile god. Unlike many Egyptian deities, Hapi had no temple of his own, no grand statue sitting in the middle of Thebes. Why? Because he was the Nile, ubiquitous, omnipresent. Male in form, but depicted with soft curves, almost androgynous, with blue-green skin and lotus offerings in each hand. He wore belts of reeds and carried the weight of the river in his very body. His job? Balance. Not just floodwaters, but the equilibrium between Upper and Lower Egypt, between growth and restraint. When the waters arrived just right, Hapi was praised in festivals. People danced along the banks, tossed bread into the current-painted murals of the god with arms outstretched, binding the two lands together with flowing abundance. Hymns called him the nourisher of all, bringer of life, father of fish and grain. His praises weren't optional, they were practical. If you wanted water, you honored Hapi. But when the flood disappointed, when the crops failed, or when entire towns were washed away, the mood changed. Offerings grew urgent, rituals intensified. Temples added extra incense to the altars. Priests chanted longer, louder, because sometimes Hapi wasn't answering, or worse, he was angry. Still, Hapi wasn't alone in the flood story. Other gods circled this watery drama. Khnum, the ram-headed god, was believed to control the Nile's source at Elephantine. He wasn't just the keeper of the river, but a divine potter who shaped each human on his wheel, including the flow of their lifeblood, and by extension, the Nile itself. Appease Khnum, and the waters flowed. Ignore him, and the wheel stopped turning. Then there was Isis, the great mother, the magician, the one who pieced together her murdered husband Osiris and wept for his death. And those tears? Some said they became the Nile's flood. In this version, the inundation wasn't just water, it was sorrow made sacred, a river of mourning that returned life to the land, which meant, in years of poor floods, the problem might not be with the river, but with the balance of the cosmos. Was Osiris forgotten? Was Isis still weeping? And on darker days, some whispered of Seth, god of chaos and desert storms. If the flood came too strong, crashing through fields and swallowing homes, it wasn't Hapi, it was Seth. A warning, a disruption, a crack in the harmony. And just like in their myths, it was up to priests and pharaohs to restore the order through rites, through rebuilding, through remembering. These beliefs weren't naive, they were narrative, a way to explain the unexplainable, to cope with unpredictability, and most importantly, to act. If you believed the gods had moods, then you had rituals to shift them. If you believed the gods responded to human intention, then your prayers weren't meaningless. They were maintenance's spiritual irrigation for a spiritual flood. And these rituals were precise. Processions carrying statues of Hapi to the river's edge. Animal sacrifices timed with the flood's height. Ceremonial boats launched into the current, bearing gifts meant to please or appease. Songs sung at dawn to greet the river like an honored guest. Every chant, every offering, every flicker of flame on the water was part of a delicate conversation between people and power, because the Nile wasn't a faucet. You couldn't turn it on. You could only welcome it, thank it, plead with it, or try to understand its silence. And when it failed, when the water came too late, or not at all, it wasn't just an agricultural issue. It was a spiritual crisis, one that echoed from the riverbanks to the throne. So tonight, as you lie quiet and still, imagine standing at the water's edge, a clay jar in your hands, whispering a wish into the current. You're not asking for control. You're asking for kindness, for balance, for just enough. Because the gods of the Nile weren't cruel. They were complex, like the river itself. And sometimes all they wanted was to be remembered. Far to the south of ancient Egypt, beyond the temples and grain fields, the Nile narrows and rages. There, at the first cataract near modern-day Aswantha River, changes personality. It crashes. It churns. It speaks. And it was from this turbulent stretch that Egypt's earliest flood whispers first arrived, if you were patient, if you knew how to listen. Unlike the calm, predictable Nile that meandered through Memphis or kissed the feet of Luxor's pylons, The southern stretch was wild, rocky, interrupted by rapids and granite islands. But for ancient Egyptians, this wasn't chaos. It was the source, the beginning of the flood's voice. And at the center of it all was Elephantine Island Sacred Outpost, a military post, and most importantly, an early warning station. You see, before the flood reached the delta, or the temples in Thebes, it had to rise here first. That meant the priests at Elephantine were the first to feel the shift, the slow creep of the waterline, the growing hum of flow, the slight change in the river's scent. They watched it like astronomers watch eclipses. Carefully, reverently, obsessively. They had their own Nilometer of the oldest ever found carved into the bedrock, with stairs leading down into the river's embrace. Still visible today, still damp with the echo of centuries. As the water rose, priests marked it day by day. The difference of a single cubit could change everything. One early surge, and the temples up north would begin their preparations. One sluggish delay, and the kingdom would hold its breath. But here's where it gets interesting. The observations made at Elephantine weren't kept secret. They were sent, carried north by foot, by boat, by whispered rumor. A priest's record sealed and delivered to temple scribes, sometimes reaching the capital before the flood itself. Think of it as an ancient weather report, but sacred, spiritual meteorology. There's even evidence that some messages were relayed symbolically. A certain kind of incense burned publicly, a festival altered slightly, a priest seen walking barefoot through a specific gate. For the common folk, it may have looked like tradition, but to the initiated, it was code. The waters are rising. And it wasn't just about water levels. The cataract region was filled with omens. Birds behaving strangely, rocks uncovered too early or hidden too long, echoes that bounced differently between granite boulders. The people of the South Nubians, islanders, desert dwellers had their own flood wisdom, passed down through song and story. And though they were often seen as outsiders by the great temples, their signs were respected, integrated, trusted. Some tales say that before a great flood, the crocodiles in the cataract region would vanish for days, as if hiding from a wave only they could sense. Others claim the wind changed direction and carried a scent like wet clay, even before the river touched the first village. Whether these were myths or observations softened by time, no one can say. But they were believed, deeply. And all of this watching, this waiting, this decoding tied back to the central truth of ancient Egyptian life. The flood was not just a natural event. It was a message. And those who lived at the edge of the first cataract were the first to hear it. The Nile didn't just roar here. It spoke. The rocks channeled it. The cliffs echoed it. And the priests translated it. So imagine now, as the world around you stills, standing barefoot on a sun-warmed stone ledge, eyes fixed on the narrow ribbon of blue snaking through granite. You feel the vibration through your toes before you see the water change. You turn to your fellow watchers, and no one speaks. But you all know it's coming. And just like that, the journey begins not with a flood crashing into fields, but with a whisper threading through rock and time. A warning, a promise, a voice from the river's beginning, winding northward like a dream, buried in a crate, wrapped in dust, pressed between crumbling layers of old papyrus. That's how the flood first spoke to the king, not through the roar of the river or the shout of a priest, but in the quiet scratch of ink written long ago by someone with a steady hand and a worried heart. These were the flood reports-early administrative documents that carried immense weight. And while they weren't wrapped in gold or sealed with divine names, they were among the most powerful pieces of paper in all of ancient Egypt. They came from temples, from watch stations, from places like Elephantine and Heliopolis and Hermopolis, carried by messengers, often in the middle of the night, to reach the palace as quickly as possible. The reports didn't predict the flood, they confirmed it, or warned of its delay. And the moment a pharaoh read them well, or more likely, had them read to him, decisions followed. Grain reserves opened, temples prepared. The machinery of a divine monarchy adjusted itself to the pulse of the river. One surviving fragment, brittle and faded, reads simply, "The waters have surpassed the red line. Fields of Kent are submerged. The stair has reached its 9th cubit. Hapi rises." It doesn't sound poetic, but to a ruler that sentence was everything. It meant, you're going to be okay this year. The land will feed itself. The gods are smiling. Some papyri carried more than numbers. They included observations, prayers, even small notes of anxiety from the scribes. Birds arrived early this year. The sky was wrong. The priests hesitate. These weren't just data points. They were human. A glimpse into how seriously they took their role not just as recorders, but as guardians of expectation. Because when the king made plans, he was leaning not on armies or gold, but on their words. And the reverse was true too. When the flood was low, the reports got longer, more layered. You can almost feel the tension in their lines. Some tried to soften the news with hopeful phrasing. While the level is below the 5th step, the priests have begun nightly chants. Offerings continue. Translation? Things look bad, but we're doing everything we can. Other reports were brutally direct. The river has not moved. Fish scarce. Spirits restless. You didn't need a royal decree to know what came next rationing. Appeals to temples. Maybe even a tax freeze. If the river didn't give, the kingdom couldn't take. And then there's the tone. These reports weren't written in fear. They were calm, measured, sometimes heartbreakingly precise. Like the scribes knew that panic didn't help, but clarity did. Their job wasn't to convince the pharaoh of anything. It was to speak with honesty, to make the Nile legible, to translate water into action. In one remarkable case, a papyrus includes a note from the pharaoh's court back to the temple. Just 4 words. Understood. We adjust prayers. That's it. Not a command. A response. A partnership. Between the river, the priests, and the crown. Between nature, belief, and leadership, no drama. Just flow. You might expect all of this to feel ancient, obsolete. But when you read these fragments, what hits hardest is how familiar it feels. A nation waiting on reports. Decisions made from far away. Experts measuring something everyone depends on, but few can understand directly. And woven into it are a deep trust in those who watch, who record, who speak for the unseen. Close your eyes and picture a dimly lit chamber in the palace, oil lamps flickering, the air cool and still. A royal scribe kneels beside a scroll, reading aloud the latest message from the river's edge. No one interrupts. Even the king leans forward, and in that moment, all of Egypt listens not to a god, not to a prophet, but to the quiet voice of paper. The Nile, transformed into words. It was supposed to come. The flood always came. That was the rhythm, the covenant, the heartbeat of Egypt. But in one terrible year, it didn't. The waters that had risen like clockwork for centuries stayed stubbornly low. The river curled through the land, thin and slow, like a god growing old. The priests watched, the farmers waited. The Pharaoh asked, but the Nile said nothing. This wasn't just a natural failure. It was a cosmic interruption. One of those rare moments when everything ancient Egypt trusted flickered. The temples had predicted the flood, the stars had aligned, Sirius had risen. The Nilometers were prepared, the calendars had turned, but the river refused. Records from that year scattered and fragmented tell of a strange silence. Papyrus notes grow vague. Offerings increased. Rituals doubled. Some temples held vigil day and night, burning incense in shifts. Priests whispering hymns to Hapi and Khnum and Isis, trying to stir a current with song. But the water stayed where it was, shallow, unmoving. In one surviving report, the scribe doesn't hide his fear. The stair remains dry. The priests have ceased prediction. The people murmur. That last line says everything, because when the river stopped, the whispers began. Was it punishment? Was it the Pharaoh's fault? Had the gods turned their faces? Or worse, had they left? The economic fallout was immediate. Crops failed to sprout. Granaries ran low. Tax collectors were told to stay home. In the markets, prices twisted like rope. Even the royal court felt its festivals were postponed. Gold offerings melted down to buy grain. Suddenly, the entire illusion of control collapsed. Egypt wasn't a civilization built on stone. It was built on water. And the water wasn't coming. But the most haunting effect wasn't in the fields, it was in the temples. Because this flood failure struck at the core of belief. How could the gods be so silent? How could the rituals, so carefully timed with star risings and sacred geometry, suddenly mean nothing? For priests trained their whole lives to read signs, it felt like going blind. And yet something else began to happen, quietly. A shift. With tradition shaken, some priests began to turn inward. Observations became sharper. Record-keeping grew more obsessive. Rituals, once steeped in mythic drama, were joined by more practical axe measuring wind, charting cloud movements, noting humidity. In their own way, the Egyptians began to evolve, slowly, hesitantly, from prophecy to pattern. It wasn't a rejection of the divine, it was an expansion, a recognition that the gods might not always speak through mystery, but through measurement, through the color of mud, the shape of fish migrations, the timing of distant rains in Nubia. It was, perhaps, the first glimmer of climate study, and it grew from crisis. Of course, the myths endured. People still sang to Hapi. They still wept for Isis and poured wine into the Nile. But behind the incense, the priests were keeping charts, looking for trends, trying to make sense of something that once came without question. because now they knew it could go quiet. The flood could fail, and Egypt needed a backup plan. Eventually, the Nile rose again. Not that year, maybe not the next, but it returned. And when it did, the joy wasn't just in the water. It was in the understanding that Egypt had survived without it. That even in the river's absence, the people had adapted, recalibrated, endured. The gods had been silent, but the people had listened harder. And maybe, in some way, that was the lesson. That faith isn't the same as certainty. That belief can live alongside doubt. That the river doesn't owe you anything, but still, you wait for it, year after year, because the waiting matters. Because it teaches you something even deeper than water, how to hope when the tide doesn't turn. So now, as you lie there in the hush of night, imagine that quiet riverbank, the moon overhead, a priest lighting a lantern, alone, knowing the water hasn't come, but lighting it anyway. Because that's what you do. You watch, you wait, you believe, even when the river forgets. By now, you've seen how the Nile whispered through stars, slipped through temples, echoed in scribes' ink, and flooded into fields or didn't. But in the background of it all, like a drumbeat under the melody, there was one more voice shaping Egypt's understanding of the river. A voice older than any priest, softer than any chant, but sharp as reed papyrus. Folklore, the stories passed between mothers and daughters, between elders and children gathered by the water's edge, where myth and memory blurred until you couldn't tell which was which. One of the oldest tales told of a serpent deep beneath the Nile. Not a monster exactly, but a sleeping guardian. If the people honored the river, the serpent remained still, curled in the black mud, dreaming. But if they were greedy, if the land grew unbalanced, it stirred. Its shifting body created either flood or drought, depending on how angry it was. That's why some grandmothers would say, "You never take the river for granted. The serpent hears everything." Another tale spoke of a silver boat that sailed the Nile only at night, visible only to those pure of heart or drunk enough to believe. In the boat rode a silent boy with lotus petal eyes. Wherever his boat glided, the flood would follow, but if you tried to follow him, he'd vanish into mist, and the river would turn away for a year. Children were told not to swim too far at dusk, just in case they interrupted his passage. Better to sit still and listen. And then there were the river songs, not hymns for gods, but lullabies for the land, sung while fishing, or threshing grain, or rocking a baby under a thatched roof. Lines like, "Happy hears the feet of the frogs before they leap," or, "If you dream of egrets, plant your seeds again." Half poetic, half practical. These were wisdoms wrapped in melody, passed down like family heirlooms, often sung by people who couldn't read, but could feel the flood's moods better than any temple chart. The power of these stories wasn't in their accuracy. It was in their comfort. When the flood was late, the myths reminded people that the Nile had always returned even if the gods took the long way home. When the flood was too high, the songs reminded them that others had survived worse. They gave shape to the unknown, personality to the unpredictable. In a land where every cubit of water could tip a family's future, storytelling was a kind of resistance, a way to hold the chaos and smile anyway. Even the pharaohs weren't above a good flood tale. Some royal inscriptions tell of dreams where the gods personally invited the Nile to rise. In others, divine animals swim ahead of the floodwaters, clearing the path. Were these metaphors? Probably. Were they believed? Entirely. Because, in ancient Egypt, believing something didn't make it fragilate, made it useful. And then there were the jokes. Yes, jokes. Because sometimes laughter was the only thing standing between you and fear. In one preserved scrap of village graffiti, someone carved, "The gods have gone fishing." Back next year. Underneath it, someone else added, "They better bring water." A dark chuckle scratched into limestone, still sitting quietly somewhere, waiting to be found. These stories and songs weren't footnotes. They were infrastructure. The soft foundation that supported all the charts, stars, prayers, and bricks. You could lose a temple. You could misread a Nilometer. But if you still remembered the song your grandmother sang while washing clothes in the river, you still knew how to wait, how to hope. And maybe that's what made Egypt endure. Not just the engineering, or the religion, or even the Nile itself, but the people's ability to weave mystery and meaning into the mud. To sit on a cracked step at sunset and tell a child, "Don't worry, the flood comes late sometimes, but it always finds its way home." As your own river of thought slows down, imagine that fireside scene, a child leaning on their elder's shoulder, eyes heavy, listening to a tale of a silver boat and a sleeping serpent. Outside, the Nile is silent. But inside that story, the water is already rising. As centuries turned, empires shifted, and gods were renamed or forgotten, the Nile kept flowing. But Egypt? Egypt began to change. Slowly at first, like the river's gentle curves, and then all at once, as foreign powers arrived with new tools, new calendars, new ways of controlling time and water, the old rhythms didn't vanish overnight. They eroded, like soft silt carried downstream. And with them went the intimate dance between flood and faith. The Greeks came first, curious and respectful. They marveled at Egyptian wisdom, borrowed from it, even worshipped Isis as their own. But they brought their own systems, their own methods of record-keeping. Then came the Romans, who didn't just observe the Nile, they measured it obsessively, turning flood data into imperial spreadsheets. They maintained the Nilometers, yes, but they also made the Nile part of logistics, grain for Rome, taxes in denarii. The river was still sacred, but now it was also business. By the time Arab scholars arrived, bringing new languages and instruments, the Nile had become something of a paradox. Still the same old river, still rising and falling with the breath of the stars, but now buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, empire, and imported meaning. The Nilometers kept working some, even rebuilt under Islamic rule, but their measurements now fed into royal decrees and agricultural ledgers, far removed from the temple songs of Hapi or Khnum. And yet, the old stories didn't disappear. They just retreated, shifted shape. Mothers still told their children not to bathe in the Nile during certain moon phases. Fishermen still claimed to see flashes of silver boats on foggy mornings. Farmers still paused, mid-harvest, to glance up at the stars and murmur a line their grandfather had whispered, "If the lotus opens early, so will the flood." Even in modern times, well into the 19th and 20th centuries, Egyptian villages celebrated the coming of the flood, Paper lanterns were floated downriver, dances held, songs sung with melodies that probably hadn't changed in 1,000 years. Children played in the silt as their ancestors did, squishing the season between their toes. The language was Arabic now. The gods were different, but the feeling was the same. Then came the dam. First, the Aswan Low Dam in the early 1900s, then the High Dam in the 1960s. Massive, brilliant feats of engineering. And with them came control of water, of flow, of flooding. For the first time in Egypt's entire history, the Nile no longer dictated the seasons. No more unexpected inundations. No more riverbank villages submerged without warning. The flood, once feared and worshipped, was now scheduled. And in some ways, that was progress. Crops could be planned, cities protected, infrastructure spared. But something else was lost, something quiet. With the flood went the rhythm. The ceremonies faded. The Nilometers grew silent. The old songs, without a reason to be sung, drifted away on the wind. Still, the Nile remained, quiet, eternal, watching. And if you walk along its edge today, especially at dusk, you might catch something in the corner of your eye, a shimmer, a silence, a feeling, like the river is waiting for you to remember. Not the data, not the dams, not even the gods, but the relationship. The agreement Egypt once had with water and stars and time. Because history isn't made only in temples and tombs. It's made in how a people listens, how they belong to a landscape, how they respond, year after year, to a river's voice, even after it falls silent. As the shadows deepen and the hush of sleep settles over your room, imagine standing by the modern Nile. The lights of Aswan glimmer behind you. The dam hums somewhere in the distance. But in this moment, the river is still. You kneel, you press your palm to the ground, and for just a second, you think, maybe you feel it, that ancient pulse, that whispered promise, the echo of floods long past, and the stories that rose with them. Somewhere between the stars above and the river below, the Egyptians found a rhythm, a logic beyond logic. And it all came down to one quietly brilliant thing. They watched carefully, faithfully, over centuries, not with telescopes or satellites, but with trained eyes and patient hands. And in doing so, they developed something astonishing, an early flood prediction system. Not a myth, not a miracle, but a system so refined it shaped one of the longest-lasting civilizations on Earth. It started with patterns. When the priests noticed that Sirius rose just before the flood began, they didn't just marvel, they measured. They timed. They built their calendar around it. Then they noticed the lag between the star's appearance in the southern sky and the river's swelling in the delta, usually about 2 weeks. That delay became part of the formula. Next came cross-referencing. Priests and scribes gathered readings from different Nilometers across Egypt. If the southern riverbanks rose earlier, they'd factor that into their estimates for the north. They weren't just watching one stretch of water, they were mapping a wave, tracking how it traveled, how quickly it reached each city, each farm, each granary. They also tracked winds, animal behavior, cloud movements over the Ethiopian highlands, yes. Even back then, they understood that the Nile began far away. They didn't know about the Blue Nile and rainfall patterns the way we do now, but they sensed that something upstream controlled their fate. some high place where the rain fell heavy and mysterious. So when the winds changed or birds migrated earlier than usual, the temples took note. All of this was written, preserved, not in one place, but in many hidden in temple walls, scratched onto ostraca, painted into ceilings, embedded in agricultural manuals. A decentralized archive of flood memory. And eventually, the Egyptians began to make predictions, real ones. The flood will rise in X days. The river will reach this mark. These weren't guesses. They were expectations built on observation. Some priests issued formal announcements. In one temple fragment, a line reads, "Prepare the lower grain beds. Hapi's hand approaches before the new moon." That's not poetry. That's a weather forecast ancient style. It's easy to forget that this was done without modern tools. No satellites, no pressure gauges, just shadows, footsteps, and a deep sense of place. Imagine that. A civilization using sunlight angles on stone walls and the bloom of papyrus flowers to predict something as massive as a continental flood. And doing it so well that it worked for over 1,000 years. But here's the most beautiful part. They never stopped respecting the mystery. Even as their predictions improved, even as they tracked cubits and storm cycles, they still sang to Hapi, still left offerings by the river, still treated water as sacred. Because they understood something we often forget, Chintz, and wonder are not enemies, they're partners. Watching the stars didn't mean you stopped believing in gods. It meant you believed the gods were precise. And so, Egypt thrived. Not because they controlled the river, but because they listened, adjusted, waited, observed. They knew that power doesn't always come from domination. Sometimes it comes from paying very close attention. So as you lie in the dark now, with the hum of the modern world fading around you, think of Thetan's entire civilization quietly counting, recording, listening, one foot in the sky, one hand in the river, and both eyes wide open. Because even now, in our world of blinking screens and endless noise, maybe we could use a little of that ancient patience, that reverence for cycles, that deep-rooted trust in the world's subtle signs. Maybe tonight, the flood you're waiting for isn't water at all. Maybe it's an idea, a change, a moment. And just like the Egyptians, maybe all you need to do is watch. And now, let it all slow down. Let the ancient voices drift back into the quiet. The temples grow dim. The river settles. The stars blink softly in the velvet sky above. You followed the flood from its celestial beginning to its earthly return, step by step, breath by breath. And as you lie here, still and safe, your mind floats like a reed boat, gentle, drifting, unhurried. There's nothing more to search for tonight, no mysteries to solve. Just the rhythm of your own breathing, calm as the Nile at twilight. You're part of the story, no resting, where memory and water meet, wrapped in stillness. The night holds you. The river dreams beside you. You've walked the floodplain of time. And now, it's time to sleep.